Max Davis hadn't planned on starting over at 47, but after selling his logistics business and watching a decade-long marriage disintegrate under the quiet pressure of unmet expectations and irreconcilable lifestyles, he found himself craving simplicity. Not the kind sold by coastal wellness retreats or productivity gurus, but the real kind. The kind that comes with silence, physical labor, and the undeniable ownership of something solid, immovable. He and Maddie, Madeline, had married 2 years ago after a slow, no-nonsense courtship. She was steady, pragmatic, with a biting wit and a deep sense of personal boundaries. She didn't need fixing and didn't ask to be rescued, which suited Max just fine. She had spent 20 years in healthcare management and bore the scars of it not on her face but in the way she scanned a room. Always calculating risk, always reading people. Together, they bought the house. It wasn't fancy, but it had land. A solid, 2-story house on the bend of a T-shaped street just past the edge of town. One direction led to a cul-de-sac where the older houses stood like planted oaks, aging but firm. The other led to a small rise with younger homes and lots shaped irregularly. Leftovers from a municipal expansion no one had fully planned. Their house sat in the corner, with a wide side driveway that wrapped around the back like a service lane. The previous owners had used it to park trailers and contractor vans. Max saw potential: storage, workspace, maybe even a steel awning for repairs or projects. To anyone else, it was just a chunk of concrete. To Max, it was room to breathe. The neighbors greeted them with a mix of politeness and mild curiosity. Some brought casseroles, others waved from across their yards. Karen Lockwood was the outlier. She came alone, 3 days after they moved in, with a pie she hadn't baked herself and a story she clearly wanted to tell. She wore linen like armor and had the tone of someone who considered herself the unwritten authority of the street. Her house stood adjacent to theirs, separated by a narrow strip of lawn and the long stretch of the side driveway. She had lived here for 23 years, had hosted the street's 4th of July potluck every summer, and her late husband had once been on the city's zoning board. She said all of this not boastfully, but with the calm implication that her word was usually final. She welcomed them in that vaguely formal tone older women sometimes use with people they're not sure how to classify. Newcomers, second marriages, couples with no kids. When she handed Max the pie and said, "I hope you'll find the neighborhood accommodating," he could feel the unspoken clause trailing behind it. The conversation was polite, shallow. She made a comment about their side driveway, something like, "It's so convenient how that wraps around, isn't it? A few of us have used it from time to time, for overflow when we host larger gatherings." Max nodded politely, not yet registering the implication. She didn't wait for approval. She just smiled, waved at Maddie, and walked back across the lawn, a woman perfectly comfortable with her own sense of entitlement. The first weekend was calm. Max built shelving in the garage, cleaned the gutters, and measured the slab for a potential workshop extension. Maddie started pruning the side garden that had been left to die by the previous owners. They ordered pizza, drank whiskey on the back deck, and for the first time in months, both felt something close to ease. On Sunday afternoon, a line of unfamiliar SUVs and minivans began to appear along the street. Max thought nothing of it until he stepped outside to grab a package and saw 3 cars lined up in their side driveway, one partially blocking the garage. There were people unloading gifts, children running across the grass, and a woman pulling folding chairs from her trunk like she was setting up for a parade. He followed the sound of laughter and music to the Lockwood house and saw what could only be described as an organized event. A birthday party, maybe, or a family reunion. A dozen or more guests mingled around tables in her yard, sipping wine, eating finger food. No one had spoken to him. No one had asked. He stood at the edge of his property for a long minute, watching a man in cargo shorts lean against his fence, sipping a beer as if the space belonged to him. Then Max turned around and walked back inside. He didn't say anything at first. Maybe it was an oversight. Maybe someone parked there assuming the space was public or shared. But when he mentioned it to Maddie, her response was immediate and sharp. "If you don't stop it now, they'll never stop. That woman didn't ask. She told." The next day, Max moved 2 heavy planters to block the entrance to the side drive. Nothing dramatic, just enough to prevent vehicles from entering. He left a printed note taped to one. "Private drive, no parking." The reaction was swift. Karen appeared the following morning with a practiced smile and a cup of coffee she didn't intend to offer him. "Oh, I noticed the planters," she said, tone bright but slightly brittle. "I hope you don't mind, but a few of the guests yesterday were family. Some of them drove quite a ways, and I didn't want them walking from down the block." We've always kind of shared this space over the years. It's just been a neighborhood thing. Max, standing on his steps, stared at her for a beat too long. "It's our property, Karen. No one asked. I'd like it not to happen again." The smile never reached her eyes. "Of course," she said coolly. "I just thought we were being neighborly. But if that's the tone you're setting—" She trailed off, gave a little nod, and walked away. That night the trash cans were tipped over. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough to send a message. The following week, a local contractor came by to offer a quote on grading the side drive and installing a gate. "You're not the first one to call about her," he muttered. "Lockwood's got a reputation. People just don't say it to her face." Max didn't reply. He wasn't looking for conflict, but he'd spent enough time around systems, supply chains, freight policies, customer disputes, to know when someone was maneuvering. Karen hadn't just assumed the driveway was shared. She had treated it as hers in waiting. The idea of someone new coming in and reclaiming space she had already mentally colonized was intolerable to her. And now she was working her influence the way quiet tyrants always did. Sideways, behind closed doors, under the table. Within days, they started noticing other things. A city code violation letter arrived regarding an unauthorized structure. A compost bin Max had moved from the backyard to the side for better drainage. Then came a flyer for a neighborhood planning meeting, hosted at Karen's house. No invite for them, but it was posted to their mailbox anyway. Maddie, who didn't like playing games, suggested documenting everything. Max agreed. He bought a trail cam and mounted it on the back corner, aimed discreetly at the driveway. He called the city, requested a formal plot map, and filed a quiet inquiry about boundary markers. Nothing aggressive, just due diligence. But none of this changed the fact that every time they left the house, they had to scan for intrusion. Karen wasn't yelling. She wasn't throwing things or pounding on doors, but her message was clear. You may own the land, but she owned the narrative. Max felt it in the way other neighbors glanced at him with a hint of hesitance, how conversations paused when he approached. Somewhere along the line, she'd begun rewriting the story of them, not as new residents adjusting to a community, but as disruptive elements challenging long-standing norms. And Max had no intention of letting her write the ending. The morning it escalated was quiet, unusually so. Max woke before sunrise, as he usually did, and took his coffee to the edge of the kitchen, where the large window overlooked the side driveway. The first thing he noticed wasn't the car parked crooked near the fence. It was the silence. No dogs barking from down the block, no sprinklers hissing, no sound of tires rolling over asphalt. Just stillness, the kind of silence that didn't feel natural. It didn't take long to spot the problem. A black sedan, unfamiliar, sat with its front tire pressed just over the edge of their grass, its rear bumper less than a foot from the side wall of the house. Max blinked, processing the audacity of it, then quietly placed his mug down and stepped outside, not bothering with shoes. As he approached, he took note of the license plate, temporary tags from out of state, and the faint smell of cigarette smoke still hanging in the air. Someone had parked it there within the hour. He walked slowly around the vehicle, taking stock of a long, fresh scrape along the side paneling of his own truck, parked further up the drive. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was fresh. Metal scraped, paint transferred, and tiny shreds of red plastic lodged in his rear bumper. Max crouched beside it, staring at the mess for a long moment, then stood up and walked back toward the house. Before he even reached the door, his phone vibrated with a text from Maddie, who had just left for work. Saw a bunch of cars up the street again. Her backyard is full of people. He didn't respond. He simply went inside, pulled up the trail cam feed on his laptop, and rewound to 4:17 a.m., when headlights briefly illuminated the corner of the frame. The image wasn't clear, but the angle showed the car pulling into their driveway, pausing as if confused, then continuing forward without hesitation. No attempt to knock, no apology. Just another uninvited presence claiming their space. Max saved the footage, attached a timestamp, and copied it to a flash drive. He wasn't sure what he'd do with it yet, but instinct told him to keep records. By mid-morning, the driveway was full again. 4 cars this time. 2 compact sedans and an SUV half-blocking the access path to the backyard gate. Max waited, arms crossed, watching from the side of the porch as people came and went with trays of food and paper decorations. There was music, too, something upbeat and invasive, with a cheap speaker dragging the bass out like an unwelcome echo through the fence slats. He waited until the 5th car tried to pull in, an old blue Chrysler with peeling paint, and then stepped into view, holding up a hand. The woman inside, maybe in her late 20s, rolled down her window and smiled brightly. "Oh, is this not okay?" she asked, clearly confused. "Karen said we could use the side lot. She said the neighbors were cool with it." Max didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "It's not a lot. It's our private driveway, and we're not cool with it. Please move the car." The woman blinked, caught off guard by the directness, and then nodded quickly. Sorry, she didn't mention that. She reversed awkwardly, tires squealing slightly on the edge of the grass. Max waited until she was gone, then walked toward the other vehicles. He took photos of each license plate, then moved the planters from the entrance and replaced them with 2 metal barricades he had borrowed from a friend who worked event security. Maddie had insisted they keep them in the garage, just in case. It felt paranoid at the time. Now it felt like foresight. By early afternoon, the street buzzed with tension. Karen hadn't come out yet, but word had clearly spread. 2 guests stood across the lawn watching Max for a few minutes before walking back inside the Lockwood house. A boy, no older than 12, threw a crushed soda can over the fence. Max didn't pick it up. He left it exactly where it landed. Around 4 p.m., a patrol car rolled slowly down the street. Max had called them, not for the damage, not for the music, but for the principal. He filed a report for vehicle-related property damage, not naming Karen directly, but making sure to include the time-stamped footage, the photos, and a printed satellite map of the property lines. The officer, a young guy with a notepad and the tired face of someone who'd seen this kind of neighborhood drama too many times, took everything down quietly. "Honestly, sir," the officer said, flipping to a fresh page, "you're doing all the right things. Keep documenting. It may seem minor, but it adds up, especially if she keeps pushing." Max nodded. "She will." When the officer left, Maddie arrived. She parked across the street and walked slowly up the drive, scanning the scene. Her jaw clenched at the sight of the cars still parked along the edge, though none had dared to cross the barricades. She didn't speak until they were inside the house, doors closed, blinds drawn. "She's escalating," Maddie said, voice flat. "And she's testing to see if we'll back down." "We won't," Max replied. "But we're not playing it her way." That night they sat down together and drafted a formal letter, citing property encroachment, damage, and misuse. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't even angry. It was precise. Max sent it through certified mail, signature required. He also dropped a copy into the city's neighborhood services complaint portal, attaching all relevant documentation. He didn't expect immediate action, but he knew better than to wait until the situation turned volatile. The goal wasn't to win. It was to draw a clear line and hold it. 2 days later, the retaliation arrived. Not loud, not overt, just a subtle bureaucratic slap. A letter from the local zoning board, triggered by an anonymous complaint. According to the notice, the Davis property was flagged for unapproved alterations to exterior usage zones. A vague and confusing phrase that, upon review, referred to the barricades. Max called the number listed and was met with a labyrinth of transfers, dead ends, and clipped voices telling him someone would get back to him. The same day, another letter came, this time from the sanitation department, warning them of improper waste disposal related to construction debris. They hadn't done any construction. They hadn't moved a single piece of equipment. But someone had filed a claim, and now there was a record of it. Max didn't get angry. He got focused. He began keeping a dedicated logbook, a thick, weatherproof binder stored in a locked cabinet in the garage. Every letter, every phone call, every photograph, every interaction. Not a digital folder, a physical, undeniable record, because he knew what people like Karen counted on wasn't chaos. It was fatigue. The hope that eventually their target would grow tired of fighting and surrender, quietly and politely. But Max wasn't built to surrender. Neither was Maddie. And if Karen Lockwood wanted to keep turning this into a war of attrition, she was about to learn that not every opponent folds under pressure. The first formal response from Karen didn't arrive through her voice or a conversation at the fence, but as a neatly folded letter placed inside a transparent sleeve and taped directly to the front door of Max and Maddie's home. It wasn't signed, but the phrasing was unmistakable, passive-aggressive formality cloaked in neighborly concern. The note stated that certain members of the neighborhood had expressed discomfort about the recent installation of obstructive structures and the unwelcoming atmosphere allegedly being promoted by Max and Maddie's decision to block off a historically shared access point. The wording was intentionally vague, lacking any direct accusation, but its intent was clear. You're being watched, and you're being blamed. Max peeled the letter off the door without a word and dropped it on the kitchen table where it sat beside 2 city notices. One legal pad of notes, and the beginning of a list Maddie had titled, "Document Everything They Try." It was that evening, while carrying groceries in from the truck, that Max noticed the side driveway had been chalked. Someone had written in large, curving script, "No walls between neighbors," followed by a smiley face. It would have been childish if it weren't so deliberate. There were no children on their side of the street. No one had been playing outside. The handwriting was that of an adult, rounded, slow, calculated. Max didn't photograph it. He simply hosed it off, dried the slab with an old towel, and added a note to the logbook. Chalk message, side driveway, approx. 3:45 p.m. Removed. 2 days later, a man in a municipal vest appeared in their yard. He didn't knock first. Max saw him through the side window, measuring from the edge of the house to the fence, writing something down on a tablet. When Max stepped outside and asked what was going on, the man replied tersely, "Zoning review. We've received a formal request to verify property boundary structures against the new civic ordinances." Max asked for identification, and the man, slightly annoyed, flashed a laminated badge. When pressed for the origin of the complaint, the man hesitated. "Anonymous," he said. "But it's filed through official channels, so we have to assess." Max nodded and let him finish, even offering the recent plot maps and zoning documents he had already filed with the city. The man seemed relieved, used to hostility perhaps, and left with a quiet, You'd be surprised how often this kind of thing happens. That evening, Max and Maddie reviewed their options. They didn't want to escalate with a lawsuit. Yet. But the signs were clear. Karen wasn't just annoyed, she was organizing. She wasn't acting alone anymore. Her language had spread. At least 2 neighbors on the corner had stopped waving when Max walked past. One woman even crossed to the other side of the street during her dog walk. It wasn't paranoia, it was coordination. Someone was controlling the narrative again, and Max understood now what that meant. Social attrition designed to isolate, wear down, and delegitimize through consensus, not conflict. Max responded the only way he knew how, physically. He began preparing the site for the wall. Not a barricade or a fortress, but a clear, architectural divider that would establish ownership and eliminate ambiguity. The design was modest, low-profile brick with concrete footing and steel rebar. It would run parallel to the drive, offset by a foot from the property line, just enough to allow maintenance without crossing boundaries. It wouldn't block views, wouldn't impede traffic, wouldn't create shade. It would, however, send a message. This is our space, and we are not asking for permission. He hired a local masonry crew, independent, professional, and accustomed to doing work without drama. He paid in full for permits and flagged the dig zone himself with bright orange markers. The materials arrived in a single flatbed delivery. Bricks, bags of mortar, a portable cement mixer, and stacked pallets labeled with the company's stamp. The project began on a Wednesday morning. By noon, the first layer of the brick was down, and the forms were drying in the sun. That same day, Karen called the police. 2 officers arrived at 3:20 p.m., one visibly annoyed before he even stepped out of the cruiser. We received a call about an illegal obstruction being built, the officer said, eyeing the wall and the workers. Max showed the permits. The foreman backed him up. The officers took photos, made a few notes, and left without incident. But the interruption was strategic. Work had to be paused for an hour. The crew charged overtime for the delay. Karen stood across her lawn the entire time, arms folded, watching. She wasn't shouting or pacing or confronting anyone. She didn't need to. Her power wasn't in confrontation. It was in forcing others to react. Maddie stepped outside briefly and met her gaze across the property line. It wasn't a stare-down. It was a statement. We see what you're doing, and we're not leaving. The following morning, the crew arrived to find that someone had dragged 3 garbage bags of broken glass and yard clippings across the work site. Not dumped directly, just strewn, like wind-blown debris. There was no camera footage, no witnesses, nothing actionable. Max didn't bother reporting it. He swept it himself and logged the time in his binder. Later that week, a neighbor, quiet man, lived 2 doors down, name was Greg, stopped Max during a walk and said, "Just so you know, Karen asked us to sign a petition about that wall of yours. I didn't, but others did. You might want to prepare." He didn't elaborate, and Max didn't press. But the implication was clear. She was trying to make it political now. Turn the issue into a neighborhood vote. Frame them as disruptive, obstinate, anti-community. By the end of the week, the wall was finished. Clean even, structurally sound. It looked like it belonged. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't hostile, it was precise. The crew packed up. Max paid in cash and tipped well. That night, he and Maddie sat on the back porch with 2 glasses of whiskey, listening to the quiet. "Do you think this will stop her?" Maddie asked, not hopeful. "No," Max said, "but it stops this part of it." Because Karen would adapt. She wouldn't back down. But now, for the first time, she had run into a line she couldn't cross without consequence, and that changed the game entirely. The wall had changed the dynamic, but it hadn't ended anything. It had simply shifted the energy, like water rerouted by a dam. For a few days, there was silence. Not just literal, but behavioral. No parked cars, no letters, no chalk messages, no unexpected visitors measuring property lines or knocking under the pretense of community check-ins. Max and Maddie, cautious not to fall into the illusion of resolution, stayed alert. They didn't relax, but they allowed themselves small moments of exhale. A full weekend without interruption, a trip to the hardware store without coming home to a surprise in the yard, an afternoon in the backyard where the only sound was wind through the trees. Then, on a Monday morning, Maddie received a call at work from the city code office informing her that a formal complaint had been filed regarding improper drainage and surface water redirection stemming from recent, unauthorized construction. The voice on the other end wasn't accusatory, just procedural, but the timing was unmistakable. Max had prepared for this, too. He had photographed every stage of the wall's construction, documented the slope and runoff lines, and kept a copy of the contractor's soil impact analysis. He uploaded everything to the city portal before lunch, and by the next morning, the file was marked as closed. Still, the intention behind the complaint wasn't resolution. It was disruption. A reminder from Karen that this wasn't finished. That same week, a neighbor Max barely knew, a man named Jeff who worked night shifts and mostly kept to himself, approached Max during a walk with a low, hesitant tone. "She's passing around a binder," Jeff said, not looking directly at him. "She says it's about neighborhood standards and the wall is just the start. I didn't read it, didn't want to get involved, but I figured you should know." Max thanked him and didn't press further. He didn't need to know the contents. He knew the method. Karen had changed tactics again. Instead of reacting, she was preemptively defining the terms of the story, turning him and Maddie into villains by quiet erosion, not attack. It was an old game, one Max recognized from years spent in business disputes. Take control of the framing, and everything else falls in line. Maddie suggested a meeting, not public, not confrontational, just formal enough to show they weren't hiding. She contacted their city council liaison and requested a neutral space to review and discuss the ongoing tension. Not an accusation, but a mediation. She was smart about it, framing the situation around language the city responded to: property rights, misuse of civic resources, systemic pattern of targeted complaints. The liaison agreed to meet them, and by the following week they were sitting in a small municipal office across from a man who had read every report but hadn't seen the whole picture until now. They presented their documentation without drama: photos, permits, timestamps, the logbook, the letter from Greg about the petition. It wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Maddie spoke with clarity and restraint, while Max underscored the larger concern. Coordinated harassment through administrative means. The liaison listened carefully, took notes, asked questions. When they finished, he leaned back and said, "This is going to sound technical, but it's the right way to do it. I'm going to recommend a formal property use audit, not just on your home, but on surrounding properties. It won't target her directly, but if something's off, it'll surface. If she's abusing channels, it'll show in the pattern. That's the best path forward right now. It'll shift the burden to the system." Max and Maddie both nodded. It wasn't a silver bullet, but it was pressure in the right place. The audit was scheduled for the following month, and in the days leading up to it, things grew quieter. Not calm, just still. It was the tension before a storm, the waiting space where people recalculate. Then, without warning, Max found his side gate open one morning, unlatched and swinging slightly in the wind. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, just open. The latch wasn't loose. It had to be lifted manually. He reviewed the footage, but the camera had been obscured. Someone had taped a leaf to the lens with a thin film of packing tape. Again, not damage, just interference. A symbolic message. We can get in. Max didn't speak to Maddie about it until dinner. When he did, her reaction was measured but sharp. It's psychological now. She's not trying to win anything. She's trying to make us second-guess everything. But we won't. They installed a second camera. Not hidden. Visible. A statement of its own. 3 days before the audit, Karen came to the property line for the first time since the wall had gone up. She didn't call out. She didn't wave. She just stood on her side of the line, eyes tracing the bricks as if measuring them. Maddie, pruning roses in the backyard, noticed her and stood upright, meeting her gaze. Karen didn't speak. She simply turned and walked away. That night, Maddie said something Max hadn't heard from her before. Not fear, but calculation. She's gauging whether she's pushed too far, and she's not done. Max didn't disagree. He knew what Karen was testing. Not legality, not victory. She was testing resolve. And she was about to learn that some lines, once drawn, don't get erased. They get reinforced. The audit came and went with professional silence, the kind that didn't warn or reassure but simply moved forward under the weight of due process. Inspectors walked the properties with clipboards and tablets, measuring setbacks, checking for violations, noting landscaping intrusions and illegal drainage connections. Max watched them from his kitchen window with the calm detachment of someone who had nothing to hide, but who understood that silence didn't mean safety. Karen, on the other hand, was visible, overly so, walking alongside the inspector assigned to her lot, speaking in low tones, gesturing often, offering papers from a slim binder she seemed to carry only for effect. Maddie, noticing the performance, made a single dry observation as they both stood by the sink. She's already spinning it, before the ink even dries. 3 days later, a letter arrived. Not from the city, but from a private legal firm in another county. It was formatted as a cease and desist, vague in accusation but dense in legal posture, claiming that Max and Maddie had created a pattern of targeted hostility, including the erection of permanent physical barriers in a historically shared thoroughfare, and were obligated to remove all obstructions to preserve easement norms. The phrasing was precise but empty, and Max recognized immediately what it was: a bluff. There was no easement. The property was platted with no shared right-of-way. The firm had no standing. But that wasn't the point. The letter was meant to intimidate, not through law, but through cost. It was a psychological ploy, the suggestion of legal complexity, the looming threat of endless paperwork and billable hours, the notion that even if you win, you lose in time, energy, peace of mind. Max handed the letter to their attorney the same day, a methodical woman named Elaine, who specialized in property disputes and had zero tolerance for theatrics. Her assessment was blunt. This is manufactured. I'll send a formal rebuttal and request they provide basis for the claim. If they don't respond in 7 days, we file for nuisance action. Max nodded. He didn't ask for escalation, but neither would he allow the ground to shift beneath him without resistance. That weekend, they found a dead cat in their side yard. It wasn't theirs. It wasn't from the neighborhood. No collar, no identifying marks, just curled beneath the hydrangeas with a smear of blood behind one ear and an unsettling stillness that felt unnatural. Maddie called animal control, who arrived with quiet professionalism, bagged the animal, and left no speculation. But something in the air changed that afternoon. It was no longer about control. It was about contamination, bringing rot to the edge of your order, daring you to respond with something other than restraint. Max didn't speak much that day. He worked the yard in silence, trimming branches, checking locks, walking the perimeter with quiet intensity. That night he installed a third camera, low, concealed near the base of the wall, pointed not at Karen's house but at the open stretch between properties where shadows moved too easily. On Monday, Maddie's workplace received an anonymous complaint alleging that she had misused professional resources to support a private legal conflict. The HR representative who handled it was sympathetic and annoyed. "It's nonsense," she told Maddie, handing her a printout of the claim. "No return address, no specifics, just enough to trigger protocol. We have to document it, but you're not in any trouble. Off the record, someone's playing games." Maddie nodded, thanked her, and walked out of the office with a tightening in her chest that wasn't fear, but something sharper. Violation. Not of rules, but of decency. The battle had officially crossed into sabotage. That night, they found a cracked plastic fork jammed into the soil near the front door. On it, someone had written in marker, "Build fences, not walls." It wasn't clever. It wasn't even original. But it was close. Too close. Left like a calling card. Max filed a police report the next morning. He didn't expect results, but it formalized the record. The officer, same one who'd responded to the earlier parking issue, took his statement quietly, then added, "She's not going to stop, is she?" Max didn't answer. He didn't need to. In response, they did two things. First, they expanded their insurance policy to include legal defense coverage for property disputes and installed motion-sensitive floodlighting along the full length of the driveway. Second, they scheduled a meeting with a city mediator, not a counselor or neighborly go-between, but a real, process-bound municipal mediator tasked with assessing potential civic liability in escalating private conflicts. Karen was invited. She declined through her attorney. That refusal mattered. It showed a pattern. The city noted it. And that shifted the tone from neighborly dispute to formal liability containment. 2 nights later, someone keyed Max's truck. Deep, curved gouges ran along both sides, deliberate and slow, as if done without hurry. He found it in the morning, and by instinct alone, he didn't call the police immediately. Instead, he checked the camera footage from the new low-mounted unit. At 2:17 a.m., a figure entered frame, hooded and small, possibly female, approached the truck and moved alongside it with something in their hand. The footage wasn't high-resolution enough for ID, but the gait, the posture, the way they paused at the wall afterward. Max had no doubt. He burned the footage to 2 drives, stored one off-site, and gave the other to their attorney. Elaine watched it in silence, then said, "She's leaving civil territory. That's going to hurt her if this hits court." Max didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just nodded once and went home to file another report. By the end of that week, the mediation office issued a formal recommendation to the city. Initiate a third-party review of civic complaint usage in the neighborhood, citing disproportionate filings from one address over a 12-month period. The implication was clear. Karen's tactics had drawn attention beyond Max and Maddie. Now, she was in the system's spotlight, and that changed everything. The pressure had finally shifted direction. Not enough to break the siege entirely, but just enough to alter the current. There was a sense, unspoken but undeniable, that something was building. Karen had overreached, and the system had begun to notice. Not with the speed or force of justice in a movie script, but with the slow, bureaucratic weight of accountability, the kind that can't be bargained with or shouted down. It started with a phone call from the city auditor's office confirming that an internal review of residential complaint patterns had been initiated based on mediation data and corroborating evidence. Max was told, politely but firmly, that further input wasn't necessary at this stage. The implication was clear. You've done enough. Now, let us look. For the first time in months, Max and Maddie allowed themselves the smallest breath of relief. But it didn't last long. Karen, sensing the momentum slipping, launched a new angle. This time it wasn't a letter, or a car parked askew, or a symbolic intrusion. It was a formal civil suit. The paperwork arrived by courier on a gray Thursday morning, delivered with polite efficiency and heavy in tone. She was suing them for emotional distress, public defamation, and unlawful obstruction of a shared civic pathway, citing community testimony, long-standing neighborhood traditions, and selective legal precedents pulled out of context and jammed into an incoherent but legally filed narrative. Max read it slowly, page by page, and when he finished, he didn't speak. He just placed it on the table, walked to the garage, and retrieved the locked binder where every detail, every report, every time-stamped photo was cataloged. It was all there, layered and indexed, and now it would serve its full purpose. Not just protection, but proof. Elaine reviewed the suit with a grim sort of satisfaction. "This is exactly what we needed," she said, flipping through the accusations like a mechanic evaluating a broken engine. She's documented her own escalation, emotional distress. We have half a dozen statements showing reverse harassment, defamation. She circulated a petition filled with false claims, and we've got 3 witnesses ready to say it publicly. And unlawful obstruction? She tapped the city permit for the wall. She just filed a suit against a structure the city itself approved. The response was methodical. Elaine filed a countersuit, not just a defense but an aggressive legal response framing Karen's actions as systemic harassment, misuse of civic infrastructure, and intentional property interference. The claim was long, detailed, and supported by everything they'd gathered, including testimony from neighbors like Greg and Jeff, who had since stepped forward after witnessing Karen's coercive tactics. The court date was set for 3 weeks out, and the time between moved with the slow, tense anticipation of approaching weather. Karen, in those weeks, changed tactics again. She stopped appearing in public. No walking the yard, no watching from her windows, no uninvited guests. Her car remained parked in the same place for days at a time. But the quiet wasn't peace. It was reloading. Flyers began appearing around the neighborhood, unsigned, listing vague accusations about Max and Maddie, changing the culture of the street, referencing intimidation tactics, and calling for a return to community harmony. It was propaganda, amateur and desperate, but it struck a chord with some. At least 2 neighbors stopped speaking to Max entirely, and another left a note on their door saying only, "You could have handled this differently." The night before the hearing, someone threw eggs at the wall. Not many. 3, maybe 4. One splattered against the mortar and dripped down like paint. Max stood outside in the dim security light and watched the yellow smear dry against the bricks. He didn't clean it. He took a photo. Then he went inside, sat at the table with Maddie, and said, "After tomorrow, we don't flinch." No matter what she tries next. The courthouse was quiet the next day, sterile and fluorescent. Karen arrived with 2 people, her attorney, thin and defensive, and a young woman who sat behind her with crossed arms and a clipboard but didn't speak once. Max and Maddie came with Elaine and their binder, and they didn't bring emotion. They brought facts. The judge, a man with a tired voice but sharp questions, made it clear from the start that evidence would speak louder than accusations. Karen's attorney presented first, weaving a story about community disruption and psychological harm, gesturing to maps of the street and photos of the wall as if it were a hostile barrier in a war zone. Karen, called to speak, described a shift in tone since the Davises moved in, referencing feelings of exclusion, discomfort, and aggressive territorialism. Her words were rehearsed, carefully delivered, and disconnected from any material evidence. Then Elaine stood. Her tone wasn't theatrical, it was exact. She laid out the timeline, point by point, the ignored verbal requests, the written warnings, the property damage, the sabotage, the smear attempts, and finally the false civil complaint. Each point supported with documentation, each document correlated with action. She called no witnesses, but submitted written testimony from 3 neighbors who had experienced similar issues with Karen in the past, and one anonymous note referencing her use of political connections to interfere with zoning enforcement. The judge listened, nodded often, and asked only one question. "Were you at any point informed that this driveway was legally shared property?" Max answered simply, "No. We were told the opposite, and we have the plat to prove it." The ruling didn't take long. Karen's complaint was dismissed in full, and the court issued a formal statement recognizing a pattern of coordinated harassment. No fine, no jail, but an official record. Her credibility, once assumed, was now formally in doubt. But more than that, her myth was broken. And that changed the balance permanently. The weeks following the ruling unfolded not with celebration, but with silence, not the tense, calculated quiet that had once preceded Karen's maneuvers, but a genuine absence of motion, as if the street itself had finally released a breath it had been holding for too long. Her house remained dark most evenings, curtains drawn, blinds closed. No more parties, no guests, no petitions or flyers. The once overly curated flower beds along her walkway began to wilt, their edges browned and curling like burned paper, and the front porch, once kept immaculate, collected dust, dead leaves, and the occasional circular that no one retrieved. Max didn't gloat, and Maddie didn't speak of it much, but they both felt the change like a shift in gravity. The pressure was gone, and in its absence came a strange, unsettling calm. Not quite peaceful, but quieter than any day since they'd moved in. Their wall remained untouched. No new vandalism, no late-night disturbances. Even the egg stains, which Max had never bothered to clean, eventually faded into the brick like battle scars absorbed into old stone. The security lights still flicked on at dusk and the cameras stayed mounted, but no new footage ever arrived. No prowlers, no strange visitors, no quiet trespasses caught at 3:00 a.m. The footage became mundane. Raccoons, wind, the occasional neighbor's cat slinking across the fence. It was anticlimactic in the best possible way. A few neighbors, emboldened by the outcome or perhaps just tired of the silence, began to reach out. Greg stopped by with a six-pack one Friday evening and sat with Max on the porch without saying much at all for the first half hour. When he finally spoke, it was with a weary shrug and a quiet admittance. "We all knew what she was. No one ever pushed back before. I guess we just figured she'd always be here, doing her thing." Max didn't offer absolution, just poured 2 glasses and let the conversation drift elsewhere. In early spring, a "for sale" sign appeared on Karen's lawn, subtle, tucked into the bushes near the walkway. Not the large, proud kind, but the kind used when someone wants to leave without noise. No open house, no flyers on doorsteps, just a listing online, handled by a firm based out of county. Maddie found it one evening while scrolling, her tone flat as she showed Max the details. The photos were oddly sterile, the interiors carefully staged to erase any personal touch, as if the house itself had decided to forget its history. 2 weeks after the sign went up, a car pulled into Karen's driveway in the early hours of the morning, headlights off. Boxes were loaded, furniture wrapped. There was no farewell, no final confrontation, no dramatic moment of eye contact across the property line, just motion, and then absence. The new owner arrived quietly. A woman in her 30s with 2 young kids and a dog that barked too much the first week but quickly settled. She introduced herself properly, brought over baked goods, and asked straightforward questions about waste collection and school routes. There was no mention of history, no allusions to the wall or what came before, just curiosity, openness, and a willingness to be neighborly without politics. Max and Maddie left the cameras up, not because they expected more trouble, but because some habits, once necessary, became part of the structure itself. The wall remained, not just as a line of bricks but as a line in memory, a tangible reminder that boundaries, once established through patience and proof, didn't need to be defended daily to remain real. They didn't repaint it. They didn't cover the old egg stain. They didn't landscape around it to soften its presence. They let it stand as it was, simple, firm, permanent, One afternoon, Max stood by the edge of the drive, watching the wind stir the branches above, and caught sight of the new neighbor walking her dog along the sidewalk. She waved without hesitation. He returned the wave. Nothing more passed between them. No need for explanation or detail. Just mutual acknowledgement. He turned back to the house, stepped past the wall, and felt for the first time in what felt like years that he had finally reclaimed the one thing Karen had spent so long trying to take: the space to live without permission.